8 people were wounded, 2 others seriously after a gunman opened fire on a bus near the old city of Jerusalem in the early hours of Sunday morning. Israeli authorities say a Palestinian gunman opened fire on the bus in an attack that came a week after violence flared up between Israel and Gaza's resistance groups, which left 49 Palestinians dead. Police say the shooter later turned himself into Israeli authorities. Palestinian resistance groups praised the attack, but so far no one has claimed responsibility for the attack. Jerusalem Post columnist Emily Schrader is in Tel Aviv and joins us now via Zoom for the latest. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us. Perhaps let's just start with the number of casualties. What is it put at this moment as we speak?
Hi. So first of all, thank you so much for having me. So as it stands right now, we still have 8 people who were injured in this attack, including, by the way, a pregnant woman. These were all civilians. And in addition to that, at least 4 of them were American citizens. So this was a pretty brutal attack, which targeted a public bus of worshipers, people who were coming from the Western Wall, from prayers at the Western Wall, who were targeted by a Palestinian terrorist on their way back.
And as you mentioned, we heard about the pregnant woman. I believe that she was on the way to the emergency section of the hospital, something like that. But can you tell us a little bit more about what led to the attack from the information that you've gathered so far?
So I think that unfortunately there isn't a clear-cut motive for this attack other than what we have seen throughout the last few years, which is that this isn't related to the last wave of violence between Israel and Gaza, but rather to an ongoing campaign of incitement to violence that we've seen across social media, across the Palestinian society, that continues to plague from infancy until adulthood the Palestinian society. So this is a byproduct of a culture of incitement, a culture that has praised violence against not just Israelis, as in Israeli soldiers, but Israeli civilians.
Now, we understand from reports that a New York Police Department overseas liaison has identified the suspected gunman as Amir Sadawi, apparently a 22-year-old Palestinian who lives in East Jerusalem. Has there been any more official word from the Israelis or the Palestinians themselves?
So this morning there was a report that a Palestinian did turn himself in and claim responsibility for this attack. As of now, the Israeli authorities have not confirmed that this individual is in fact the terrorist who carried out the attack, but I think there's pretty reasonable reason to believe that this is the person who carried out the attack. What happens in the future remains to be seen. We'll wait for an official statement from the government or from the police themselves. But I think that there is pretty reasonable intelligence to believe that this is the person who carried out the attack, who initially fled, robbed a car, stole a car, and then fled to Silwan, another neighborhood nearby in East Jerusalem.
And do we have any knowledge about who he is, what he is sympathetic to, and what may have motivated the attack?
So as of now, there hasn't been any kind of official statement from any official body. But again, I go back to the same problem that we've seen across multiple terrorist attacks for many, many years now. And that is that we've seen a culture which raises Palestinians to hate Israelis, to hate Israeli civilians, despite the fact that when they target Israelis, they may be Arabs or Jews. So it's not even necessarily reflective of their religion, but rather it's an attack on Israel, the state of Israel, regardless of their faith. And I think this is something that we have seen throughout the last few years, that we need to ensure that other people understand that it's not just coming from the terrorist organizations themselves, but rather from a culture that encourages incitement to violence.
I mean, obviously, you are sharing with us your views, your lived experience, and what your beliefs are. We spoke to an Israeli-American journalist just last week who was actually a very, emphatic about the fact that it is wrong to just label them as a terrorist who just willy-nilly, without cause, attack Palestinians, that some of them are trying to protect what ought to be their sovereignty that has been taken away from them, that they actually do have a cause. And you're just saying that Palestinians have been brought up to hate Israelis and attack anyone who's either on Israeli soil or is seen to be within the or the proximity of Israeli interests?
I think that there is a clear-cut problem with incitement from infancy in the Palestinian Authority. Does that mean that Israel is perfect and that everything that they do is flawless or that they do it the best way possible? Of course not, including in operations that are occurring today. But at the end of the day, the core of the problem is a Palestinian, at the government level, a Palestinian rejection of the Jewish right to self-determination, of the Jewish right to establish a Jewish state, to have a Jewish state here in what is the indigenous homeland of the Jewish people. Now, that doesn't mean that the Palestinians can't have a state. It doesn't mean that the Arabs don't have rights or that the Palestinians don't have rights. They absolutely do. But that also comes with responsibility of acknowledging the Jewish history and the Jewish self-determination that occurs here as well. And I think it's impossible to argue about what the causes are of these different terrorist attacks without also acknowledging that there has been a concerted effort to deny Jewish self-determination in this land historically since the establishment of the State of Israel, or should I say reestablishment of the State of Israel, because the truth is that the Jewish people are from here.
Israeli Prime Minister Yair Lapid obviously condemned the attacks. The Jewish politicians, or even in the Knesset, are they hegemonic on the way forward and how to resolve the conflict?
I mean, I don't think that there's one answer from any politician or any party even on how to resolve this conflict long term. This is something that's going to take many, many years to resolve, and many, many partners on both sides who are willing to compromise. There is not an easy fix to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but it does start with talking to each other. And what we have right now, at least from the Palestinian side, is a complete rejection. It's a policy of rejectionism, and it's been that way for decades. And we can't move forward until we have a Palestinian leadership which has the mandate, as in has the public support to implement a peace policy, but also has the courage to lead and to make peace with whatever Israeli government there is. There have been significant compromises in a right-wing government, and there have been significant compromises in a left-wing government. In fact, a right-wing government is actually the government in Israel which gave away more land, if we're speaking historically. So there are solutions to be had, but nothing can happen until both sides are willing to sit down and speak to each other and make the painful compromises that need to happen in order to ensure a long-term solution.
So it's your view that what seems to be the stumbling block is at least a legitimacy on the part of the Palestinian leadership and a willingness for peace?
I think that as a leader, Mahmoud Abbas is in a very difficult position, and that is because there is a serious political rival in Hamas. Hamas has complete control over the Gaza Strip, and as a result, the Palestinian Authority is very limited in what they're able to do. So the Palestinians first need to be able to unite and resolve their differences internally before any kind of peace agreement with the Israelis can be implemented. Because even if Mahmoud Abbas sat down today and said, okay, I want peace with the State of Israel, we recognize the State of Israel, he's going to face enormous pushback from more extremist factions such as Hamas, such as Islamic Jihad, who are within the Palestinian society. So there's a problem at the government level with a lack of courage, but there's also a problem in the societal level with a lack of understanding that what's in their interest long-term and what's in the interest of peace that benefits both sides is coming together for peace, is recognizing both sides. And we don't see that from the Palestinian Authority today. Of course, there are also extremists in Israel and Israeli society, but the situation isn't really the same with what we see, at least statistically in terms of polls, with the Palestinians.
All right, thank you for sharing your views. Emily Schrader is a Jerusalem Post columnist.